There is a country in East Africa that has existed for over 3,000 years, a nation that was never colonized when nearly all of Africa fell under European rule, a civilization that possessed written language when much of Europe could not read. Yet somehow, when we discuss ancient history, when we speak of great civilizations, when we recount the stories that shaped our world, this nation is often reduced to a footnote, if mentioned at all. Tonight, I would like to take you on a journey through the untold history of Ethiopia, a story of emperors and prophets, of resistance and resilience, of mysteries that still puzzle historians today. This is not the Ethiopia you may have seen in news reports. This is the Ethiopia that built tower churches carved from solid rock. The Ethiopia that defeated European armies when conquest seemed inevitable. The Ethiopia whose ancient manuscripts contain knowledge that predates the Renaissance. If you will allow me the next hour of your time, I promise you will see Africa, and perhaps history itself, in a different light. Before we begin, I want to be transparent with you. This documentary has been researched and assembled with the assistance of artificial intelligence technology. However, every fact presented has been carefully verified against historical records. This video is created purely for educational purposes, to share a remarkable story that deserves wider recognition. Now, let us begin our journey. Chapter 1: The Ancient Kingdom. To understand Ethiopia's place in history, we must travel back approximately 3,000 years, to a time when most of what we call Western civilization was still emerging from the Bronze Age. According to archaeological evidence and records maintained by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the story begins with a kingdom called Aksum, which flourished between approximately 109–40 AD. But even before Aksum, there was the kingdom of DMT, dating back to the 10th century BC. Historians generally agree that this region, known in ancient times as Abyssinia, was one of the great powers of the ancient world, standing alongside Rome, Persia, and China. The Greek philosopher Mani, writing in the 3rd century, listed Aksum as one of the 4 great kingdoms of the world. Yet this fact rarely appears in our history books. There are stories passed down through generations, recorded in the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's ancient book of kings, that connect this land to one of history's most famous figures, the Queen of Sheba. The biblical account, familiar to many of you, tells of a queen from the south who traveled to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon, bringing with her gifts of gold, spices, and precious stones. The Ethiopian tradition holds that this queen, known as Makeda, ruled from Aksum, and that from her meeting with Solomon came a son named Menelik I, who would found the Solomonic dynasty that ruled Ethiopia for nearly 3,000 years. Whether one accepts this tradition as historical fact or cherished legend, what cannot be disputed is this: the Ethiopian people have maintained an unbroken connection to this narrative for millennia. And within that tradition lies something quite remarkable. The claim that the Ark of the Covenant itself was brought to Ethiopia and remains there to this day, in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum. I mention this not to prove or disprove the claim, but to illustrate something important. Ethiopia's self-understanding, its very identity, has always been woven from threads of both African and ancient Near Eastern heritage. It is a crossroads civilization, and that made it unique. But beyond legends, the archaeological record reveals something equally fascinating. The Aksumite Empire was a genuine superpower, controlling trade routes between Rome and India. They minted their own coins, a sign of significant political and economic power, featuring the names of kings and Christian crosses, in 3 languages, Ge'ez, Greek, and South Arabian. In the archives of the Roman Empire, we find references to Aksum as a trusted trading partner. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century merchant's guide, describes the port of Agilis as bustling with trade in ivory, gold, and exotic animals. The kingdom built towering stone obelisks, some reaching over 100 feet in height, carved from single pieces of granite. These still stand today, technological marvels that required sophisticated engineering knowledge. Perhaps most significantly, in approximately 330 AD, King Izana of Aksum converted to Christianity, making Ethiopia one of the first Christian nations in the world, preceding most of Europe by several centuries. It's worth pausing here, because this detail changes how we see everything that follows. Chapter 2: The Mysterious Rock Churches. As Aksum's power gradually waned over centuries, a new center of Ethiopian civilization emerged. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human history, yet it remains relatively unknown outside specialist circles. In the 12th and 13th centuries, in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, a series of churches were constructed in a manner so unusual, so technically challenging, that engineers today still debate exactly how it was accomplished. These churches were not built upward from the ground. They were carved downward, hewn from solid volcanic rock, excavated from the living stone of the earth itself. 11 churches, each carved as a single, complete structure from the bedrock. To create them, workers had to first excavate enormous trenches around the footprint of the planned church, then slowly, painstakingly carve away the stone to reveal the structure within, like freeing a sculpture trapped in marble. But here is where the mystery deepens. According to tradition, these churches were built during the reign of King Lalibela in the late 12th century, possibly as a response to the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, to create a new Jerusalem in Ethiopia. The timeline suggests this massive undertaking was completed in just 23 years. There are two explanations historians offer for how this was possible. One is widely accepted. The other is rarely discussed. The accepted explanation involves thousands of skilled laborers working in shifts, using the tools available at the time, iron chisels and hammers, working the relatively soft volcanic tough stone. It would have been an enormous undertaking, certainly, but within the realm of possibility. The second explanation, preserved in Ethiopian tradition, is more unusual. Local oral history insists that the churches were built with supernatural assistance, that angels worked alongside human laborers during the night hours, completing work that would have otherwise taken generations. I mention both interpretations not to advocate for either, but because they illustrate something important about how different cultures understand their own past. Regardless of how they were built, what we can observe today is remarkable. These churches feature complex drainage systems, carved windows, decorated arches, and interior columns, all hewn from solid rock. The Church of St. George, perhaps the most famous, is carved in the shape of a cross when viewed from above, descending 40 feet into the earth in perfect geometric precision. Some of the churches are connected by tunnels and passages carved through the rock. There are ancient paintings on the walls, manuscripts in alcoves, and according to archaeological surveys, the rock carving technique shows remarkable consistency and planning. What the documentary evidence reveals is not dramatic, but it is profound. These structures have stood for over 800 years with virtually no structural support beyond the rock from which they were carved. They remain active places of worship today, maintained by monks and priests in an unbroken tradition spanning centuries. UNESCO designated them a World Heritage Site, yet they remain largely absent from general historical consciousness. One must ask why. Chapter 3: The Nation That Resisted Colonization. To understand what happened next in Ethiopia's story, we need to place ourselves in the late 19th century, during what historians call the Scramble for Africa. Between approximately 1881 and 1914, the European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and Italy, divided the entire African continent among themselves. In 1884, at the Berlin Conference, European leaders literally drew lines on maps, creating borders and claiming sovereignty over lands they had never seen, over peoples they had never met. By 1914, only two African nations remained independent: Liberia, which existed under American protection, and Ethiopia. How did Ethiopia alone maintain its independence while nations with larger armies, more resources, and longer-established kingdoms fell to European control? The answer lies in a battle that took place on March 1, 1896, a battle whose significance has been largely forgotten in Western histories, but which represented a turning point in the relationship between Africa and Europe. In 1889, Emperor Menelik II signed a treaty with Italy called the Treaty of Wuchale. However, there was a problem. A significant problem that would lead to war. The treaty was written in two languages: Amharic, the Ethiopian language, and Italian. In the Amharic version, Article 17 stated that Ethiopia could, if it chose, use Italy's diplomatic services in dealings with other European powers. In the Italian version, the same article stated that Ethiopia must conduct all foreign relations through Italy, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. This was not a translation error. This was deliberate deception, designed to allow Italy to claim international recognition of its control over Ethiopia while the Ethiopians believed they had signed a simple friendship treaty. When Menelik II discovered this discrepancy in 1890, he immediately repudiated the treaty. Italy's response was to prepare for war, confident that their modern European army could quickly subdue what they assumed would be a poorly organized African resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. What happened at the Battle of Adwa was unprecedented in the colonial era. Emperor Menelik II mobilized approximately 100,000 troops, a massive force that included warriors from across Ethiopia's diverse regions and ethnic groups. Contrary to Italian assumptions, many of these soldiers were equipped with modern rifles, some purchased from European arms dealers, others captured in previous skirmishes. The Italian force numbered around 18,000, a sizable army by any measure, equipped with modern artillery and led by experienced officers. On March 1, 1896, in the highlands near the town of Adwa, these two forces met. By the end of that day, the Italian army had suffered one of the most decisive defeats any European power would experience in Africa. Nearly 40% of the Italian force was killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands of modern rifles and multiple artillery pieces fell into Ethiopian hands. The global impact of this battle cannot be overstated, though it often is. Italy was forced to recognize Ethiopian independence completely. The news spread throughout the colonized world, from Africa to Asia to the Caribbean, that a European army could be defeated, that colonization was not inevitable, that resistance was possible. In the archives of African American newspapers from that period, we find articles celebrating the victory at Adwa as proof that people of African descent could stand as equals to any nation. Marcus Garvey would later cite Ethiopia as inspiration. The Rastafarian movement would center much of its theology on Ethiopian independence and the figure of Emperor Haile Selassie. Yet in most Western education systems, the Battle of Adwa receives at most a brief mention, if it appears at all. One must wonder what other pivotal moments in history have been similarly marginalized. For the next 40 years, Ethiopia remained a sovereign nation in a colonized continent. It joined the League of Nations in 1923, the only independent African member state. But independence did not mean isolation from European ambitions. In 1935, Benito Mussolini, seeking to avenge Italy's humiliation at Adwa and to build a new Roman Empire, ordered the invasion of Ethiopia. This time, Italy employed chemical weapons, mustard gas, in violation of international law, and eventually occupied the country until 1941. Emperor Haile Selassie went into exile and gave a famous speech to the League of Nations in Geneva, warning that Ethiopia's fate would be the fate of all small nations if aggression went unpunished. His warnings were ignored. Within 3 years, Europe would be at war. The Ethiopian resistance continued throughout the Italian occupation, and in 1941, with the assistance of British forces, Haile Selassie returned to his throne. Ethiopia became the first of the colonized African nations to achieve liberation in World War II. Chapter 4: The Hidden Treasure. There is another dimension to Ethiopian history that rarely receives attention, its literary and scholarly tradition.Ethiopia developed one of the world's oldest written languages, GEZ, which has been in continuous use for religious and scholarly purposes for over 2,000 years. The modern Amharic language evolved from it, but GEZ remains the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, much as Latin functions for Catholics. In monasteries scattered across Ethiopia's highlands, often in extremely remote locations accessible only by foot or rope ladder, are collections of manuscripts that date back more than a millennium. These include the Garima Gospels, carbon dated to between 330 and 650 AD, making them possibly the world's oldest complete illustrated Christian manuscripts. Thousands of religious texts, historical chronicles, medical treatises, and astronomical calculations. Illuminated manuscripts with artistic styles found nowhere else in the world, a unique fusion of Byzantine, African, and indigenous Ethiopian aesthetics. Many of these manuscripts have never been fully catalogued or translated. They sit in monastery libraries, protected by monks who have sometimes died defending them from invaders, but largely inaccessible to scholars. What knowledge might they contain? What historical details, what scientific observations, what philosophical traditions have yet to be discovered? According to researchers who have had limited access to these collections, there may be hundreds of thousands of manuscripts still unexamined. Some monasteries are only now beginning to allow careful documentation efforts. It would be incomplete to discuss Ethiopia's untold history without addressing what most people do know about Ethiopia, or think they know. In 1984 and 1985, a catastrophic famine struck northern Ethiopia, exacerbated by civil war and government policies. News coverage of the crisis, particularly the BBC report by Michael Burke and the subsequent Live Aid concert, brought images of suffering into homes across the Western world. Those images, powerful and heartbreaking as they were, created a narrative that has proven remarkably persistent: Ethiopia as a place of poverty, helplessness, and dependency. This is not to minimize the reality of that suffering, which was genuine and devastating. But it is worth pausing to consider how a single moment in a nation's 3,000-year history became, for many, the entire story. Imagine if all anyone knew about Great Britain was the Blitz. Imagine if the Great Depression became the only thing taught about American history. You would rightfully consider that a profound distortion. The Ethiopia of ancient kingdoms, of undefeated resistance, of rock-hewn churches and illuminated manuscripts, that Ethiopia disappeared from view, replaced by a single narrative of crisis. This matters because narratives shape policy, charity efforts, and international relations. They shape how people see themselves and how others see them. Chapter 5: Modern Ethiopia and the Unfinished Story. Today, Ethiopia is Africa's second most populous nation, home to over 120 million people representing more than 80 distinct ethnic groups and languages. Its capital, Addis Ababa, hosts the headquarters of the African Union, a recognition of Ethiopia's historical significance and its role in Pan-African identity. The country faces significant challenges, as all nations do. Political tensions, economic development needs, ethnic conflicts, and questions about governance are ongoing issues that Ethiopians themselves are working to address. But there are also developments that receive far less attention. Ethiopia has one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, with significant investment in infrastructure, including Africa's first modern light rail system. The country has become a major coffee exporter. In fact, coffee itself is believed to have originated in the Ethiopian highlands, in the Kaffa region. Ethiopian Airlines has grown into one of Africa's largest and most successful carriers, a rare example of an African airline competing successfully on the global stage. A new generation of Ethiopian scholars, artists, and historians is working to reclaim and share their nation's narrative, often through digital media that bypasses traditional Western-controlled channels. Perhaps most intriguingly, there are ongoing archaeological projects that suggest we have only scratched the surface of understanding Ethiopia's ancient past. Recent discoveries of prehistoric sites indicate human habitation dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Ethiopia may well be, quite literally, one of the birthplaces of humanity itself. So far, we have journeyed through 3,000 years, from ancient kingdoms to rock-hewn churches, from battlefield victories to hidden manuscripts. We have seen how a nation maintained its independence when all around it fell, how it preserved traditions when others were forcibly erased. Now, in our final moments together, I want to explore not just what this history tells us about Ethiopia, but what it might tell us about history itself, about what we remember, what we forget, and why. Why is Ethiopia's history so little known outside the country itself? This is not a simple question, and it does not have a simple answer. But there are several factors worth considering. First, there is the basic matter of whose history gets taught. Educational systems in every country prioritize their own national narratives and those of nations with which they have had significant historical interaction. For much of the Western world, that meant European history, American history, and limited engagement with the rest of the world except as it pertained to colonial or trade relationships. Ethiopia, having never been colonized, fell outside this framework. It was not part of the British Empire, not part of the French colonial system, not integrated into European historical narratives in the way colonized territories were forced to be. Second, there are the biases, conscious and unconscious, that have historically shaped how African civilizations are perceived. For centuries, European scholarship operated from an assumption that advanced civilization flowed only from Europe and the Mediterranean world. Evidence of sophisticated African civilizations was often dismissed, reinterpreted, or attributed to outside influence. The Great Zimbabwe ruins, for instance, were long claimed to be Phoenician or Arab in origin, anything but African, until archaeology definitively proved they were built by indigenous African peoples. Similar assumptions affected how Ethiopian achievements were understood or, more often, simply ignored. Third, there is the matter of language accessibility. Much of Ethiopian historical record is written in Ge'ez or Amharic, languages that relatively few Western scholars learned. This created a barrier to research that has only recently begun to be overcome as Ethiopian scholars with native language skills have entered international academic discourse. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, there is the simple human tendency to maintain comfortable narratives. If one's understanding of history is built on certain assumptions about who was civilized and who was not, about who had agency and who did not, then evidence that contradicts those assumptions is often simply not seen, even when it is plainly visible. But this is not merely about Ethiopia. It is about the countless other histories that remain untold, the civilizations whose achievements have been marginalized, the peoples whose agency in their own stories has been denied or forgotten. When we speak of the Silk Road, we rarely mention the African trade routes that were just as extensive. When we discuss ancient kingdoms, we seldom include Kush, or Aksum, or Great Zimbabwe. When we teach about resistance to colonialism, victories like Adwa are footnotes at best. The implications of this selective memory extend into the present day. They affect how development aid is distributed, how international relations are conducted, how people see themselves and their possibilities. If the dominant narrative is one of helplessness and dependency, that narrative will shape reality. But if we recover stories of resistance, achievement, and sophistication, different futures become imaginable. We have reached the end of our journey together through Ethiopia's untold history, though of course, we have barely scratched the surface. There are volumes more to discover: the history of Ethiopian women who ruled as powerful figures, the story of the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, the complex relationship between Ethiopia's many ethnic groups, the contributions of Ethiopian scholars to mathematics, astronomy, and theology. Each of these would require its own exploration, its own careful attention. What I hope I have conveyed is not a comprehensive history that would require many more hours, but rather an invitation to question the histories we have been told, and more importantly, the histories we have not been told. Ethiopia's story is exceptional in many ways, but it is not unique in having been overlooked. Across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and even within Europe itself, there are narratives that have been suppressed, simplified, or forgotten. Perhaps the lesson here is not about Ethiopia specifically, or even about Africa more broadly. It is about the necessity of approaching history with humility, recognizing that our education, however thorough it may seem, has likely contained significant silences. It is about the importance of listening to how peoples tell their own stories, rather than accepting only the versions that have been filtered through outside perspectives. And it is about understanding that history is not a fixed thing, completed and known, but an ongoing process of discovery and reinterpretation. The rock-hewn churches still stand in the Ethiopian highlands, carved from stone, enduring through centuries. The ancient manuscripts still rest in monastery libraries, waiting to be fully studied. The descendants of the soldiers who fought at Adwa still remember the victory that preserved their nation's independence. These are not ancient curiosities. They are living connections to a past that continues to shape the present, and they deserve to be known, understood, and included in how we comprehend human history. Thank you for taking this journey with me. I hope it has given you something to think about, not just about Ethiopia, but about the stories we tell ourselves about the past, and the stories we have yet to hear.